So today we have, our speaker is John K. Davis, who is a professor of philosophy at Cal State Fullerton and recently published New Methuselahs, The Ethics of Life Extension with MIT Press. His works in ethics, philosophy of law, bioethics, and related areas are his areas are those. You got that, right? So there's much more we can say about Dr. Davis, but he's a very modest gentleman. So I will now introduce him. Please welcome Dr. John Davis.
Great. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. This is the cover of the book I published. I put it up there primarily because I think the picture is so pretty. That tree is something called the Methuselah Tree, and it's in the mountains. Oh, can you hear me? No, okay, let me try this. All right, so I like this cover. I think MIT Press did a very nice job with the cover. It's much prettier in person. This didn't resolve real well in the picture. But that tree is called the Methuselah Tree. It was for a long time believed to be the oldest living thing in the world, other than some fungi that just keep cloning themselves forever. They now have found another tree nearby that's a little bit older, but it's around 4,000 years old. And that was why you see that picture there. So the topic that I'm going to address, and the topic that my book concerns, is something called life extension. We need to be very clear on what life extension is. So life extension is not end-of-life care. Is not what happens if you go to the hospital and you're on feeding tubes and a respirator. That sort of thing will extend your life. It keeps you alive longer. That's what it's meant to do. But it's not life extension in the sense that we're going to talk about today. What we're talking about is technology, which, if we ever get it, we don't have it yet, would either slow the rate of human aging so you stay young longer, or perhaps even halt it, conceivably even reverse it. But it's also not immortality. Immortality is what will happen if there's an afterlife, presumably, or if spirits exist or something like that. An immortal being is immortal. It's impossible for it to die, morta for death, right? Life extension is not immortality. It's simply life without biological aging or slower biological aging. So that's the topic here. Now, the first question you might have is, why would anybody write a book about a technology we don't have yet? I mean, surely there's more pressing issues than that. Well, it's actually been gathering steam for some time. I got interested in this topic back in the 90s when I was in graduate school working on a dissertation on living wills, the advanced directives. You may be familiar with these. And this seemed to me sort of out further along the same spectrum of end-of-life issues. And so I've been following it for a while. Back in 2002, about 50 leading geroscientists, and I'm talking about people who have major reputations at major universities, published something called a position statement on human aging. And what they said was they think life extension is possible, that it may be coming sometime this century, and that we need to start talking about it. There's a link here. I gather they're going to put this online, these notes, so if you want to go back and find the link, you can. I won't trouble you with that now. The federal agencies that fund most medical research in this country, at least most federally funded research, are known as the National Institutes of Health. And there are National Institutes of Health for a number of areas. There's one for geroscience. And they have a geroscience interest group. And they've already said on their webpage that they think a slower rate of aging will increase the health span, the span of your life that is long and comfortable. So when the NIH starts to say, you know, it'd really be nice if we could slow aging, it's time to take this very seriously. And there's some big money behind it. Google, which has all the money in the world as far as I can tell, founded something called Calico. I think that stands for California Life Company or something like that, back in 2013. And they're very secretive about how much money they put into this thing, but indirectly it looks like it's in the billions. And they've teamed up with a French pharmaceutical company called AbbVie, and they're presumably Google will develop drugs or something that might slow some aspects of aging, and AbbVie would then market these. They haven't come up with anything yet, but they're putting serious money into it. So it is time to start thinking about it, just as the position paper said. Now, you came for a philosophy talk, but I want to take you through a bit of geroscience first, Partly because I think it's much easier to think clearly about the ethical issues if you have a realistic picture of what this might really look like. And partly also because the science is just fascinating. I was not a science major in college, but when I got into this, I thought, gee, it would have been nice to have majored in biology or something, because it's just so interesting. The first thing to note is that aging is actually very puzzling from a biological standpoint. Organisms don't age in the way your automobile ages. If you get a new car, as soon as you get it home, it starts to age imperceptibly day by day, month by month, year by year. Right? The finish of the paint wears down, the brakes begin to wear down, the engine begins to wear down. It just, friction and weather and other things wear it out. Organisms are not like that. They replenish and renew themselves. So let's see what that means. There's some organisms that, as far as we can tell, never age, or if they are aging, they're doing it so slowly that we can't tell they're aging. And here's a list, I won't read it to you, but it includes the bristlecone pine you see on the cover of my book, sturgeons, that's a kind of fish that lives in rivers in Idaho and places like that, and some other creatures. So clearly it's possible for organisms to not age, or to age much more slowly than we do. Moreover, some species do age, but they can regenerate parts of themselves. Lizards that can grow new tails and that kind of thing. Well, if you can grow a new tail, you can presumably grow new lungs, a new heart, whatever, but it's not happening. This is a puzzle. Then too, when organisms develop, they develop from a single cell, a conceptus, I suppose, and they grow ever more complex and become vastly complicated organisms by the time they're visible to us. Now that's very difficult to do. So why is it that organisms are able to develop such complexity, but they're not able to maintain it? Because after all, they regenerate cells. They're not like automobiles that just consist of a fixed set of parts until you replace them. So here's the overall puzzle about aging. We would expect evolution to select for organisms that age very slowly or not at all because they'd have more offspring, right? If evolution is driven by, if natural selection is driven by reproductive fitness, you'd expect the organisms that live longer to have more offspring, and those offspring would pass on their long-lived genes, and they would eventually produce a very, very long-lived, if not ageless species. But that's not what happens for most species. There too is a mystery. So why is that? Well, evolutionary biologists have had a lot of fun thinking about this. There's a variety of theories. I'll give you the names of them. There's the mutational accumulation theory. This will all be in the slides that are online. The antagonistic pleiotropy theory, and something called the disposable Soma theory. Soma means body. So the body is disposable is the idea. But I think all three of them involve roughly the same idea. And so I'll give it to you the way I got it from a scientist I spoke to when I was in grad school. I was at the University of Washington, and just by chance, there were two people there who are leading scientists on this topic, and I had a chance to talk to them. And here's how they put it to me. They said, suppose you had a mouse that never aged. Well, how long is that mouse going to live? On average, about 2.5 years. Because in its natural habitat, that's how long it'll take for a predator to get it, or a food shortage to kill it off, or a cold snap to kill it off, or a disease to kill it off, or something else. That's true for most organisms. In fact, one of the scientists I spoke to, Stephen Austad, studied opossums on some islands off the coast of South Carolina, and the islands where the opossums had no predators produced longer-lived opossums. In other words, it's not just that the opossums lived longer because no one was killing them. The opossums actually aged more slowly than opossums on other islands where they did have predators. So what's going on here? Well, the thought is that it takes metabolic energy to reproduce, to feed, to fight off predators, to survive. But it also takes metabolic energy to renew cells and tissues. So designing a mouse that never aged would be a little like designing an automobile that was built so well it wouldn't wear out for 1,000 years. Right? You wouldn't want a car like that. It would be massively difficult to drive. It would cost far too much money, and it's going to be in an accident within 10, 20, 30 years anyway. So it would be a waste of money to design it to last longer than its average life expectancy in its environment. So the thought is that evolution has been efficient. It said, okay, we'll give these critters just enough metabolic energy devoted to renewing themselves So they live about as long as they're going to live before something kills them off, but it would be a waste of metabolic energy to give them any more than that. Otherwise, they'll have less metabolic energy available for running from predators, making little mice, babies, whatever else they're going to be doing. So in effect, they're designed to age only because it makes no sense to have them designed to live longer when they're not going to do it anyway. It's a waste of resources. The other two theories I talked about are somewhat similar. Basically, the antagonistic pleiotropy theory and the mutational accumulation theory both tell us that aging may result from genes that have a beneficial effect earlier in life and a harmful effect later in life. And so the thought is that if organisms only live a certain length of time in their environment anyway, the genes that have a harmful effect only later in life won't be weeded out. So for example, a gene that humans have that's likely to kill you by age 10 is going to be weeded out because anybody who dies from that is not going to produce babies. So it will leave the population. Whereas a gene that doesn't kill you till you're 80 won't have any effects till it's too late for you to make more offspring anyway. Yes, sir?
Has the fertility period of women lengthened as their lifespan has lengthened?
I don't know. That's a very interesting question. I wish I knew the answer. Yeah, all I know is the biologists tell me menopause is something of a puzzle. We don't really know why it happens, but I don't know if that's the case. Although I can tell you this. According to the archaeological record, I'm not sure which branch of anthropology it is, but those who study early humans tell us that up until some thousands of years ago or before agriculture, people tended to live about 45 years anyway, which is about when most of us start showing serious signs of aging. It's also about when menopause happens. So that may be a connection, and maybe that's sort of built in some way. Here's the basic point of all this. It's possible for us to live longer. In fact, we probably have a built-in way of doing that already, due to the ability of our bodies to renew tissues and renew cells. I think I read once that most or all of our cells, correct me if I'm wrong, are like 10 years old or less. So presumably evolution could have designed us to be more long-lived. It just didn't bother to do so. All right. Now, how might we take advantage of that fact of slow aging? Well, when you see news articles on this topic in the popular press, they'll get all caught up in this drug or that drug, or somebody gave a chemical to some mouse and it lived for 10 years or something. But I think that's an overly complicated way of thinking about it. Really, all it comes down to are two things: the technology we use and whatever genes we're going to use that technology on. Because it's going to be genetically controlled, you know that, right? I mean, aging occurs at the cellular and subcellular level, so it's going to be genetically influenced. So whatever we do has to influence our genes in one way or another. And we know what technologies we're going to use. It's going to be some drug, broadly construed, any chemical that affects the expression of genes, or it's going to be genetic engineering, perhaps through the new CRISPR method. I'll say more about that in a moment. Or it's going to be stem cell therapy. But it's going to be one or more of those three things. The real question is, what are we going to use it on, and exactly which chemicals are we going to use? There's some genetic pathways. I won't go into that at the moment. It doesn't really matter what they are, because this sort of thing changes from year to year. But there's some more exotic methods here. Sometimes people say, well, we'll have little nanomachines, and they'll be in our bloodstream, and they'll repair damage and all that. I'm not sure I want that. I mean, most machines I've had malfunction from time to time, so I don't want them in my bloodstream. It doesn't seem to be a very practical way. It makes much more sense, I think, to take advantage of the anti-aging defenses our bodies already have. Some people talk about uploading our minds into computers, and we can live as long as the computer is maintained. This was originally proposed, some 40 years ago by George Martin, a very well-known geroscientist, who was kind enough to write me a letter about this at one point. It's theoretically possible. I think it's quite a ways off, and I wouldn't want to be inside a computer either, for various reasons. Another possible method, and this one actually does work, is the only life extension method that we are sure works, though we're not sure it works for all species. It's called caloric restriction. And caloric restriction was discovered in the 1930s. Scientists found that if you give a mouse, it's always mice we're working with, or flies, if you give a mouse a diet that's low in calories, but high in nutrition, very high in nutrition relative to the amount of calories, but a fairly low-calorie diet, the mouse will live longer. They live about 40% longer. This has been done with a number of species. They're up there on the slide. It's not clear that it works with humans, but there is some interesting anecdotal evidence. During the Second World War, there was a food shortage in Denmark and in Norway, and everywhere really. But in Denmark and Norway, the governments dealt with the food shortage by rationing the food, and they did it very intelligently. They rationed it so that people got as much nutrition as they could possibly get, but there weren't enough calories to go around. So in effect, the people of Norway and Denmark were getting what looks like a very mild caloric restriction diet. The mortality rate went down for the population during these years. People actually lived longer in the middle of a war and a food shortage. So this suggests it could work for people. And if you're interested in this, there are books on it, there are websites, you can buy calorie counters that will help you do this. I tried it once for about a week. It's really hard to do. You get very hungry about 4:30 in the afternoon, and in order to get maximum nutrition, you've got to do a lot of very complicated cooking and, maximum number of blueberries and kale and a bunch of other stuff I don't want to eat. So I kind of gave up on it. But, it's probably a good diet. It's actually very similar to the diet they recommend if you're pre-diabetic and you're supposed to get your blood sugar down. It's very much the same diet. And in fact, one of the genetic pathways that they think is involved in aging involves insulin. So there's a link with diabetes. All right. I'm going to skip over some of this stuff. The hope is that we'll eventually have caloric restriction mimetics, that is, drugs that do what the diet does, so you can just pop the pill instead of having to watch your calories. All right. Stem cells, I won't say too much about, except that we do have adult stem cells, not just the embryonic stem cells. And adult stem cells can replenish various tissues in the body, but we have fewer of them and they're less effective as we get older. So perhaps putting more adult stem cells into us would help us live longer as well. It's a possible technology. Genetic interventions involve, as I mentioned before, either drugs or actually outright genetic engineering. Drugs, just understood broadly as any chemical that modifies the expression of a gene. Genes express when they emit the proteins or whatever they're emitting, or cease to do so, right? They cease to express. Drugs can turn them on or turn them off, some drugs anyway. And you could also simply insert the proteins the gene expresses if you wanted to. So if there's certain genes that are involved in keeping the body young and healthy, you might switch those genes on with appropriate drugs. This is where a lot of the research has been recently. So the good news, or if you want life extension, it's good news anyway, is that scientists have discovered over 24 genes involved in aging that are shared by many species. We have very much the same aging genes, apparently, as mice, rats, fruit flies, worms, yeast, many other multicellular organisms. So whatever it is that's regulating aging appears to be biologically very, very ancient. It goes back quite a long ways. And so with these gene pathways in mind, scientists have had some pretty impressive results. So I've just picked a few here at random. Researchers at the University of Arkansas made nematode worms. They're very small, simple worms, so they're easy to work with. They die quickly, so you can see if it's working or not. Doing research on humans is really tough because we age so slowly. I'll come back to that later. They've made those worms live 10 times longer than normal just by altering certain genes. So if our life expectancy is, whatever it is, 85 nowadays or thereabouts, imagine if it were 850 just by modifying certain genes. In 2003, a mouse was given a mutation that affected the insulin genetic pathway. It lived for 5 years, which would be equivalent to a human living for 170 years. And I could go on. Now, I'm going to skip over some of this again. This is the form of genetic engineering, by the way. Until recently, genetic engineering was not really practical, but in the last couple of years, as you may have read in the press, there's a new method called CRISPR, and that's an acronym for this phrase down here. The basic idea is that the genes already have the ability to splice in other genetic material or splice it out. They do this apparently as a way of recognizing other things they need to recognize. And so with a bit of tweaking, you can use this to do snipping and cutting in the genes much more effectively than we've been able to do up till now. So genetic engineering is now a much more plausible technology. I won't say too much about the genetic pathways, but you can see why Google is pouring money into this. And you can see why the National Institutes of Health is taking it seriously. Now, how long is this going to take? Well, my personal opinion, I'm not a scientist, this is only my opinion, for whatever that's worth. I think it's going to be like flying cars. You know, I think it's going to take a lot longer than we think. You know, I think that it's just very, very complicated to intervene in the human genome in a way that regulates aging without any bad side effects, covers all forms of it. And on some of the theories, biological theories of aging, there may be many more genes than we expect, and they may not be related in the same genetic pathway. So the mutational, accumulation, and antagonistic pleiotropy theories are like that. According to those theories, the genes involved in aging may be quite a large and diverse set, and that would mean all the more work you have to do in order to slow aging. It could also be that more than one of those evolutionary theories of aging is true. So this could be a very complicated job. But because there's many different processes, it's not going to be a pill. We might talk about a pill as a rhetorical device, but it won't probably be a single pill, I wouldn't imagine. It might involve stem cells as well, or genetic engineering as well. Aging is not caused by a virus or a bacteria, so it's not going to be a vaccine. Probably requires several different interventions that get developed over time. Some people in Silicon Valley who are really into this stuff, the people, they're very pro-technology, and they see the human body as another engineering project, and so they really like to make themselves a little longer. They talk about something called escape velocity. So the thought is, if you've got enough money, along comes an intervention that'll help you live 5 years longer. You do that. Now you've lived 5 years longer, just long enough to catch the next new drug, which will make you live 10 years longer. At the end of those 10 years, another drug's available, so the thought is they can kind of hopscotch their way towards centuries-long lifespans or something. And I don't know if that's going to be possible. I think that's a lot of trains to catch, but maybe. At any rate, I want to emphasize this most of all, though. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding when people talk about the ethics of life extension. And that is, life extension is not going to be irreversible. It's very often spoken of as if it were the kind of choice you see in certain stories and in mythology, where you can have longer life, in fact, permanent youth if you want to, but you can never die, and you can never reverse it. An example of this would be a novel by Simone de Beauvoir called All Men Are Mortal. Simone de Beauvoir, as you know, is the significant other of Jean-Paul Sartre, so she was an existentialist. And the point of the book was a character who cannot age, and this turns out to be a fairly bad thing, right? In fact, he can't even die. But there's no reason to expect that life extension is going to be like that. So it's something you could try for a while and then give up later on if you wanted to for a variety of reasons. Even genetic engineering presumably could be reversed. All right, now I think what I'll do is I'll touch one more topic about the scientific background, and then I think it might be helpful if we have a few questions for a while before I resume the talk. We'll try that and see if that works. I want people to be able to ask questions they have now in case it's not helpful to wait longer. All right, how long would we live? Well, major responsible scientists will typically tell you, well, maybe 110 years, maybe 120, maybe 150. Stephen Austad, who I mentioned before, thinks the first person who will live to be 150 years old is alive today. Professor Austad has had appointments at Harvard, so this is not somebody with stars in his eyes. Right? This man has his feet on the ground. Richard Miller, another well-known scientist in this area, thinks some people might live to be 140. Here's a fellow who works with those nematode worms at the Colorado University, maybe 350 years, if we lived as long as nematode worms are now living in these labs. And Cynthia Kenyon, who's very well known for her work with nematode worms, thinks there's really no reason why you couldn't halt aging in the worms altogether. Now, she hasn't said you can do that for humans, but it's a possible inference. Now, I partnered up with a demography graduate student at UC Irvine named Shaheen Davidpour. He helped me out with a demographic analysis I'll get to a little bit later. So I asked him, what if we stopped aging altogether at, say, 25, right? If you're going to pick an age to stop aging, that's a pretty popular age to use. Some people might want to live a little longer, but before they halt aging. Well, you wouldn't live forever because you might cross the street at the wrong time and get hit by a bus. Or you might contract Ebola. You know, any number of things can happen. You might get killed by a stray bullet in a botched liquor store robbery, right? Something's going to get you sooner or later. It's just that you won't die of age-related causes. So if you want to know how long somebody like that would live, it's real easy. All you have to do is take existing actuarial tables and subtract out all the causes of death that are age-related, and leave in only the causes of death that involve non-age-related things like accident and violence and so forth, suicide presumably, and then see what the resulting numbers are. And Mr. Davidpour ran this for me. He came up with the same estimate that some other people have, about 1,000 years, which is an interesting coincidence if you think about how long Methuselah was said to live in the Bible. This is, of course, an average. One person getting life extension might die the moment they step out of the clinic, right? Somebody else might last for 30,000 years if they're excessively cautious and unusually lucky. So it's not the case that, you know, when you get to age 900, you're thinking my best days are behind me, you know, what work do I want to get done while I still have some time on this earth? It's not going to be like that. It's not like you're going to meet somebody and find out they're 995 and think, oh, it's too bad I won't know them much longer. When you wake up, oh, yes, sir.
Have you considered that if people live several times as long, the mortality from spouses getting tired and shooting them?
I certainly considered ennui, angst, boredom, you know, and I suppose it could be angst and boredom directed at your significant other. You've been together a little too long. Yes, sir.
I think the Rick's point, though, is that the social issues that would occur, it's almost impossible to account for them, but I bet you any money is going to cut that 1,000 years way short.
It might. It might. In fact, I think people might choose electively to cease their life extension treatments when they've had enough. That's another.
The limits of the earth.
Yeah, that's actually a very, very important issue, and I do want to spend a lot of time on that. So I'm gonna hold off the ethical issues just a few more moments, and then I'll take some more questions, then we'll get to the ethical stuff. So let's see, where was I? Well, maybe that was it. Oh, I want to say a word about what's available right now if you're interested. As far as I know, none of this really works, but you can try it if you want. You could try a caloric restriction diet. There's a couple of products on the market that purport to give you some of the same chemicals that are being used on nematode worms and mice, and they've been vetted by some doctors, I guess. My wife's a medical provider, and she looked at the ingredients in this product basis. And she said, actually, they look like good vitamins, basically. So if you want to try that, you can try that. Some people are taking a diabetes drug known as metformin, which is now off patent. They think that might slow their aging. All right. So let me pause before I get to the objections and just see if anybody has any other questions related to what we've just gone over. Yes, sir.
Speaking of the genetics, it seems like the genes are physical devices, but they contain information. So it's the non-physical information that's contained within the physical gene.
Yeah.
For example, we slough off our skin, I don't know, every couple months, every couple of years.
Yeah.
And we grow new skin. Well, my new skin isn't 20 years old. When I regrow a new skin, it comes up at 70 years old.
Yeah.
So how does this idea of addressing or changing or modifying the information that's within the genetic genome? Can you comment on that?
I'm not sure if my answer will be responsive, but let me try this and see if I've got this right. I'm sorry? Oh, yeah, the question was, we had the same information in our genes all our lives. Why is that information not producing the same result when we're in our 70s, let's say? Is that basically right? Yeah. I think, tell me if this is responsive, it really just comes down to whether that information is used. So let's say my genes contain the information in the sense that certain genes, if they're expressed, will emit proteins that enable my cells to replenish more often or something like that. The information's there, but if the gene's switched off, the body isn't using that information. Don't know if that fully addresses.
Well, if I can make a comment.
Yeah.
It kind of ties in with aging and death.
Yeah.
We fight off diseases and somewhere 60, 70, 80, 90, it's as if something is shut off.
Yeah.
But typically you see that in old people. System after system after system just seems to cut off.
Yeah.
And stop working. Is that,
Well, some people say aging is basically a series of, how was it put? Errors in transcription. Your DNA is supposed to be repairing damage to your cells. The proteins are out there to repair cellular damage, and over time it does it less and less well. And as the errors in transcription build up, things just get frail enough to the point where everything is shutting down, as you say. That's the answer that I've heard to this. Yeah. Yes, sir.
This is anecdotal, but I've dealt with a lot of seniors in, say, 85 to 95 age bracket, and anecdotally, many of them don't really want to live to be 130, 140. You can't control for the pain they're suffering from arthritic conditions and loss of neurological function. Many of them seem to have an attitude, been there, done that, I don't really want to do it again.
You know, 2 days or 3 days ago, I was sitting with my wife's mother, who is 98 years old. She said something very much like that. She's now in a wheelchair. She'll be in a wheelchair from here on out. And she was not depressed or unhappy, but she just said, I'm about ready to leave this beautiful world. You know, I think basically she felt she'd done it, seen it, her kids are doing fine, she's ready to go. Of course, the one thing I would say, I'll touch on this a little bit more when we get to that section, but bear in mind, it's one thing to feel that way when you're 98 in a wheelchair and you're frail, but if you're 98 and you've got the body of a 30-year-old and many, many years ahead of you, if you want them, I don't know how much that's going to affect our perspective. But again, I don't know if that's a question we can settle from an armchair. I'll say a bit more about that as well when we get to it. Yes, sir.
Because it affects how I would envision a longer life as a species. When we look at life extension, how does that compare to reproductive years?
Can you say that another way? I'm not sure I understood.
Okay. You can, I'm going to paint a figure. Reproduction up through 50. And you have another 30, 40 years. If you're living to 150, are you still having children? Does 150 mean you're still breeding children or great-great-grandchildren?
Yeah. I'm assuming that if they can find a way to slow aging, they can probably find a way to overcome menopause. I don't know if menopause is chronologically triggered, where a certain number of calendar years brings it on, or if it's triggered simply by aging processes in the body. If it's the latter, then if the body stops aging, presumably the trigger would never go off, in which case they would continue. In some ways, it'd be easier for us if menopause kicked in at 45, no matter how long you live and how youthful you are, because it solves some other problems about overpopulation I'll talk about in a minute. I'm afraid we may not be lucky. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, you right there.
Okay, so metformin prolonging delaying the aging process is very interesting. Are there studies about the role of sugar in the aging process?
There might be. I don't know. The literature is vast, and I'm not trained in the relevant sciences, but I haven't heard about it, except indirectly in that the insulin genetic pathway apparently is considered an important candidate for an aging pathway. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Is there a way of collecting data on the body's receptivity to ward off diseases? If you have those extended years, where does the body manufacture whatever it needs to ward off disease?
Well, you'd have the immune system, of course, of a young person if you stay physiologically young. That would be part of the answer. If some scientists who are trying to promote the idea of life extension and want more funding for the research talk about something they call a longevity dividend. So the longevity dividend, the payoff we get if people live longer, would be methods of life extension, would also be ways of reducing the incidence of diabetes, heart disease, cancer, and so on. And many scientists working in this field think that that's actually a better way to sell the idea of life extension. Rather than going around talking about making people live for hundreds of years, it might just play a little better with the funding agencies and the audiences if they talk about cancer, diabetes, and so on, even though it's essentially the same process. But I think the answer is just that the age-related diseases would be lower in incidence, right? Because a young person can still get cancer. They're just less likely to do it than they are when they're older. So we'd still have cancer. It just wouldn't be age correlated. It would be less common, presumably. Yeah, take one more question. Yes, sir.
In my late 70s, my blood pressure was 140 over 80. My doctor would tell me at my physical that I was past my expiration date. So now I'm in my mid-80s, and I found an elliptical jogging machine right across the freeway at the gym, and my blood pressure went down to 120 over 60.
Wow.
My doctor told me I was going to live to be 100.
Wow. That's
So I called and told my wife.
Yeah.
I said, I've got some good news and I've got some
I see where this is going.
I'm going to, my blood pressure has dropped 20 points and I'm going to live to be 100. But we both have the same doctor, and she went back to see the doctor and told him what I said. And he said, oh no, he's going to live to be 101.
Oh, okay. But why the extra year? I'm sorry, I'm not getting something. You say 101 rather than 100?
Well, he was just joking.
Oh, okay, yeah,
As
yeah.
he was with me.
Yeah, in some sense, you can reverse some aspects of aging just by lowering what's called the rate of failure, or risk of failure, I think it's called. One of the biological definitions of aging, and I didn't go into this in the slide, but it's really interesting. You can define aging as the rate at which the risk of organ system failure goes up. So if the risk of organ failure goes up quickly, you're aging fast. If it goes up slowly, you're aging less. The risk of failure is lowest, I think, for children around 10 to 15 years old or something like that. And then, then testosterone kicks in and it starts going up again. But, in a sense, anything you do that lowers the risk of failure has, in effect, reset the clock. So in some sense, you become younger, or at least it's slow aging in that respect. It's just a matter of making your organs last longer, rather than keeping, you going on life support or something like that. Okay, one more question.
Yeah, I have a very basic knowledge of this information, but it's my understanding that one of the reasons people live longer is they have longer telomeres.
Yes.
Because each time a gene is creates another copy of itself, it loses a little bit of information.
Yes.
So how are we going to overcome that barrier in aging? Because
Yeah.
that's a physical barrier.
Yeah, let me kind of recast that for the audience. Right. So one of the theories of aging is that every time your cell divides, there's a little bit of DNA at the ends of the chromosome, like a shoelace cap, and it's made of it's called a telomere. And when the cell divides, the telomeres get shorter each time. And so one theory is that at some point they get so short, I guess the DNA frays or something, and you can't really make cells anymore. I don't have the competence to say very much about that. It's one of the theories of aging. It's not currently a favored theory, but there are some reputable scientists who are still working on that, and may be part of the story. There's been some speculation we might use telomerase, an enzyme that lengthens telomeres, but the danger of that is that might also turn the cells cancerous. And so I think the possibility of side effects and unforeseen bad consequences, it can't be discounted with some of these things. Yeah. Let me move ahead to some of the objections. I'm not going to say too much about why people might want to extend their lives. I think intuitively it's fairly obvious. I'm not saying everyone will always want to, but those who do want to would give the following kinds of reasons. Life's good, let's keep going, is what it comes down to. You can accomplish more. You'll see the future unfold. You might gain greater wisdom. If the whole human race, is one of my favorites, if the whole human race lived longer, it might grow up. We might have, it may not, yeah, I don't know. But we might make wiser choices politically. We might care more about future generations and so forth. So those are some of the reasons. But interestingly enough, if anything, a majority of people, when asked, do not want this. And many of them don't want it for anybody. Well, I'll say more about the reasons in a moment, but just very quickly, there was a survey in 2013 by the Pew Foundation of roughly 2,000 American adults. 56% said they would not want life extension if somebody offered it to them today. Who knows, right? I mean, it's one thing to say that, it's another thing to actually have the pill in your hand, but that's what they believe. 68% thought most people would want it. Only 41% thought it would be good for society. And there's actually some reason to think there may be some harm too. I'm going to come to that in a second. An Australian survey gave similar results. 65% of those surveyed said, yes, let's research this technology, but only 35% said they'd actually use it. And almost 40% thought that somebody who extends their life, who lives what I call extended life, it's bad for them. They're better off not doing it. Extended life, by the way, is the word I prefer over the term immortality. This is not immortality. It's just life with slower aging or no aging. Other surveys with similar results. So there's two kinds of arguments here. I'm going to work through these sort of one by one. There are arguments that extended life is bad for you. It's not in your interest to have it. You're better off without it. And then there's another set of arguments that a world with life extension is bad for everyone. It's a bad world. Now, I'm going to sort of show my hand right at the outset because I see I've got 45 minutes left. And I want to make sure I get enough time here. I think the two most serious objections, the ones that really concern me, have to do with justice and something I'll call the Malthusian Threat. The justice objection is only Silicon Valley billionaires or maybe just middle class people will get to have this. Anybody who's poor or not a billionaire, depends on how expensive this is, will not get it. And so we'll have a two-caste society in which some people live for centuries and others have to make do with what we're all living right now. And that is, I think, a very powerful objection. I'm going to get to that in a moment. The real central question there is that a reason to ban this or prohibit it or try to inhibit its development? Right? It's one thing to say this is a problem, injustice. It's another thing to say what we should do about that problem, but I'll get to that later. The other is the Malthusian Threat. I'm going to run some numbers for you in a few minutes here to show you how that works out. The demographer and I ran some calculations to see what the world's population would be given various possible life extensions and expectancies and various possible rates of reproduction. And some of the numbers are scary. So I'll tell you right now, I think if this is to be working at all, there would have to be some kind of limits on reproduction for those who choose to extend their lives. Maybe not for others who choose not to, but we'll get back to that. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on arguments about whether it's good for you or not, because quite frankly, I don't think this is a question you can settle from an armchair. I think philosophy is just the wrong tool for talking about this, but that has not stopped philosophers from talking about it. So I'll say a few words, right? Many people have said, and by the way, a lot of these arguments were originally made concerning immortality. There's an interesting philosophical literature about whether it's in your interest to have an afterlife where you exist forever, right? Maybe you'd be bored, right? Some of these arguments have now been used for extended life. So boredom, that's pretty straightforward. The thought is that at some point you've seen it all, done it all, it's time to go. It may be harder to accept death because if you think you could live for centuries and you find out you're dying because you contracted some disease, that might be a lot harder to take when you look 30 and you've got centuries ahead of you than it is if you're 70 and you know your time is finite anyway. Procrastination, whoops, I don't know what I did there. Procrastination, yeah, it takes too long to fool us, maybe, yeah, whatever. Procrastination, you might not get anything done. You're not facing the press of time. I mean, I face it now. There's books I'd like to write. I came to academia relatively late in my life. I had another career. And there's 2 or 3 books I'd like to write that I haven't written. And I definitely have a sense that my time is limited. If I'm going to do this, I got to get going. This was my first one, by the way. Some people say you learn courage by facing death. I think one of the better arguments like this is that it helps you to transcend narcissism. Instead of caring about yourself in the future, you sort of shift your concern to other people, your children, humanity in general, your friends, and you care about them. So instead of being depressed that you're not going to exist, you're happy that somebody else will because you care about them in somewhat the way you care about yourself, and maybe death forces us to do that. Interesting argument, might be true. Other arguments that a world with life extension is bad for everyone. entrenched elders, an opportunity drought. I made that up, but that's what happens when young professors can't get jobs because the old ones won't die off. Slower rate of social innovation. I'm not sure that's a bad thing, by the way. Some innovations I don't care for. Ageless tyrants. Just pick your favorite, or least favorite dictator and imagine this guy living forever. So, now, here's a quote, by the way. I thought this was kind of fun. The actor Richard Dreyfuss. I find myself fascinating. Middle Eastern proverb, this too shall pass. There are those who say, you will eventually get bored. I'm going to skip over some of the other things. So here's a couple of questions I'd like to pose to help us think about this. It's plausible, I think, that extended life has drawbacks. In fact, it'd be very odd if it didn't. Almost everything has an upside and a downside. What you have to do is measure the two and ask, does the upside outweigh the downside, and if so, by how much? Or if you're not sure, is that a gamble you're willing to take? So here's the basic question I think we have to ask when we think about whether extended life is worth having. And by the way, I would never suggest this has to be made for everyone. In other words, this is not a social decision, where you would presumably decide individually whether you want this or not. Is extended life a life worse than death? If it's not worse than death, then it's better than death, in which case it's at least marginally in your interest to continue going. Or if it's a lot better than death, it's really in your interest to continue going. But that's, of course, for people to decide for themselves. Now, there are those who say, we're lucky we only live 80 or 85 years or whatever the current life expectancy is. Be thankful you live and die, you'll be bored to death. It won't be such a good life, you wouldn't want it anyway. But here's the question. What's good about a natural lifespan of 80 years? Is it the fact that it's your natural lifespan, or is it the fact that it's an 80-year lifespan? Well, we can think about that in the following way. Suppose we had evolved to live 40 years and not 80. In fact, you could say we did if you look at the archaeological record, right? So if we had evolved to live 40 years, we say, thank God we didn't live to be 80. You know, where we really lucked out. Evolution did us a big favor. And some scientist comes along and says, I'd like to give you a pill where you won't be senescent until your 60s and 70s. Right? I don't think we turn that down. So the thought that it's an 80-year span seems a bit odd. As for its being natural, that gets us into some other territory. Yes, sir?
I think that, to me, the only thing that's natural is living long enough to reproduce. I feel as though, in nature, we've accomplished what we were supposed to accomplish.
Yeah. Yeah, I have some sympathy for that view. Yeah.
Beyond that is good fortune.
Yeah, and also the other question is, what is important about being natural? What's
continued existence? I mean, natural would. That's why I say natural would be. You need to stick around long enough to perpetuate the species.
Yeah.
And after that, you've done your job.
Yeah. I think that's a fair point. Well, here's another question that I would suggest for people to think about. And I don't know there's any wrong answer. It's just a question to help trigger whatever your thoughts on the matter are. And whatever they are your own business, and it's your right to decide. But it's what philosophers call a thought experiment. A little hypothetical situation you can use to find out what your moral judgments are about something. So imagine this. You're dying, and God appears. Hey, he's real. Okay. And you want to ask him something. What do you want to ask you? Well, God, am I about to just get snuffed out like a candle forever? Or is there something further? Is there an afterlife? And God says, well, I've been listening to philosophers for thousands of years, and they keep complaining the afterlife will be boring, and we won't develop courage, and we'll procrastinate. And I got so sick and tired of these people, I finally revised the whole system. It now works like this. You can turn down the afterlife right now and be annihilated if that's what you want. Or you can have an afterlife, but because I know you humans tend to change your minds, I'm going to give you an escape clause. You can end that afterlife anytime you want. You go on for 1 billion years, you can go on for 10 days, you decide how long you want to be there. If you get bored, you can check out whenever you like. And you ask God, well, what will this life be like? And God says, humans are not as adaptable as they think they are. I've made it very much like life on this earth because it's just easier to do things that way. So you'll still have cars and houses and bodies like you do now. It may be a little bit nicer than we have, and it will just go on indefinitely without aging. So the question you're supposed to ask yourself is, what would you tell God? Would you say to God, you know, I don't want the afterlife. I'm too concerned about, I've done enough in this life. I've had enough time. I'm done. Or would you say, well, let's try this afterlife for a while. After all, I can end it anytime you want. So this is obviously a metaphor for extended life itself, where you can end it by ceasing your life-extending treatments. So I think one way of exploring what your own view on this question is to think of it in terms of this scenario. And I'm not asking for any particular single answer that I think is the correct answer. I just think it clarifies what answer seems right to you, and I'll kind of leave it at that. We can talk about this more if you want to. So I'm going to pass over some of the other stuff because I want to get to the Malthusian and justice issues. Again, extended life is not immortality. Boredom, who knows? Try it and see. If you get bored, you can check out. Again, I don't think these questions can be settled from an armchair. And one of the things I tried to do in my book was get the discussion off this stuff and over to justice and Malthusian threats, where I think the real trouble lies. I think we spilled far too much ink talking about these things. But let me just move ahead a little bit here. All right, this, by the way, is a characterization I came up with in an article, and it's in the book too. There will be a new human condition, and it will have the following features. Aging will be elective. It'll be something you can decide to do or not to do as you please. You can always go off your meds and cease extended life if you want to, because it'll involve drugs, genetic engineering, stem cells, or something similar. The process of aging are continual. They have to do with I'm losing my memory of the term.
Entropy?
Entropy, and also electrons zinging around your cells. What do they call that? Free radicals. Yeah, free radicals. Electrons get in there and they bang your DNA up and so on. So the assaults and insults to the cell that lie at the basis of aging go on all the time, that have to be resisted all the time. It's not a vaccine that settles this once and for all. Death will be unscheduled. So I said earlier there's a 1,000-year life expectancy if you remove all age-related causes of death. Well, the morning you wake up in year 1000, what are your odds of making it to year 1001? Exactly the same as your odds of making it to year 2 the morning you woke up in year 1, at the end of year 1. There's something called the Gamblers Fallacy here. So if you flip a quarter over and it comes up heads 3 times, you might think, well, now it's got to come up tails because it's already come up heads 3 times, and they just don't do 4 heads in a row. But actually, the odds of it coming up heads or tails on the 4th try are 50-50, just like they were in the 1st try. So your odds of surviving day to day with odds of death that don't go up over time, that are not age-related, will be the same. Now, this is kind of interesting because I think one thing we all do is we ask ourselves, how bad would it be to die today? Well, I've made it for a while, so I think it wouldn't be nearly as bad as it would have been 20 years ago. It would have been awful 40 years ago. But now it's not so terrible. I've done a lot of what I wanted to do. And 10 or 20 years from now would be a lot better, of course. That's not going to be the case in an extended life if aging is halted. Because at any given time you die, number one, you have no reason to expect it. It will be something non-age related. And number two, it deprives you potentially of centuries. So if you are 80, and you're dying, you're deprived of, 5, 10 years, maybe 20 if you're lucky. But under this scenario, you might be deprived of hundreds of years, and that might make death harder to accept. So I don't want to suggest for one moment this is all an endless picnic or that extended life would be easy. I think it would have new challenges we're not used to. All right. Before I get to the Malthusian threat, I wanted to see if people had any questions about that set of arguments or comments on it. Yes, ma'am.
So your assumption is, or what you're presenting here, is assuming that by not aging, you don't suffer physical, mental, other kinds of breakdowns.
Correct, yeah. Yeah, if we slow aging, they'd happen more slowly if we slow aging. They wouldn't happen at all if we halt aging.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we don't need to worry about the ills of aging.
That's right, that's right. The joints that hurt more and more year by year, loss of memory, that would not be an issue. Yeah, yeah. Just as an aside too, people seem to think that living without aging at all would be really difficult, but living for another 20 or 30 years would be much easier. I think in the near term that's probably true, but really, if you can slow aging, in principle you can slow it to a halt. It shouldn't be that hard to do. Some of the earliest predictions that life extension would happen one day came from Benjamin Franklin, René Descartes, French philosopher, and Condorcet, another French philosopher. And basically the reasoning was very simple. They said if aging is a physiological process, which they believe it is, not a supernatural process, and if humans can intervene in physiological matters, which obviously we do all the time, we modify our physical environment endlessly, then theoretically we should be able to intervene in the physical process of aging. That's all it takes to predict this stuff. It was predicted centuries ago. Yes, sir, I see someone back at the back row.
If CRISPR technology was used, at what age would it be used and where the body would go?
That's an interesting question. The question is, if we use genetic engineering, CRISPR, at what age would you get the treatment, so to speak, and where in the body would it go? I don't know which parts of the body would be needed, but I suspect it would have to be every cell of the body, because aging occurs in every cell of the body, so it would have to be throughout the body. You could do it with an embryo. You know, the easiest way to get something into every cell of the body is to do it when you only have a few cells to work with, and then the organism just develops. But I think ethically, you'd almost have to wait until somebody is 25 or so, or 21, until they're an adult. I think it would be wrong for parents to force this on a child, partly because there may be some risk of iatrogenic harm, that is harm caused by the procedure itself, but also because it may be that not everyone wants this. And so I think it's probably a matter of choice as to when we do it, but I would say it shouldn't be done until the 20s. Yes, sir.
There is a international convention among genomists not to do CRISPR or anything like it on embryos. There is also a pair of little girls who were born in China in the last few months who had CRISPR quote, therapy on their embryo. The scientist who did that is apparently in jail with threat of being executed, if you believe the news about China. So it's very much an ethical question, what should be done. But in terms of what can be done, that particular genie has poked its head out of the box already.
That's a better answer than my answer. Thank you. Yeah, that's the right way to put it, I think. Yes, sir.
And I'm a bit confused about stopping aging. Does stopping aging stop growth?
Yeah, I honestly don't know. That would be another reason not to try it too early. I'm not sure, and I'm going way out on a limb here, because I'm not a biologist. I'm not sure aging happens in children in the way that it does as you get older. I mean, there could be deteriorated teeth get worn down, right, and the body changes and develops. But aging in the sense of an increase in the risk of failure of organs doesn't really happen until later life. So it may be that there's just no aging to work on at that point. The body's defenses against tissue damage and cell damage are so good, they really can't be improved very much, and there wouldn't be any reason to do it. Yes, sir.
Well, there is a disease in children that you see, progeria,
Yes.
where a child ages prematurely, and almost exclusively those children tend to be small.
Yes.
So there has to be some association with that the cells just don't do what they would ordinarily do, just other than just speeding up the process.
Yeah, I don't know very much about progeria. One scientist I've read or spoken with, I can't recall which, said that progeria, this is the disease that makes little children look like old people. You've seen this somewhere probably. He said that progeria mimics aging, but he thinks it's not the same as aging. I don't know his reasons, so I don't know if he would think we could draw analogies from progeria. For me, it's an open question. You may be right. I just don't know. Yes, sir.
Two questions come to mind as I look at life extension, slowing aging. One is, how do we have to reconsider the idea of suicide?
Yes.
The second is, what do we want to do differently with the added years from the years we've had until now?
Say the second part of your question again, I didn't quite catch it.
With okay, OLLI is a good example of, most of us were out of school for a long time, and we then came back. This is using our additional years differently.
Yes.
What would those extra years mean in terms of possibility?
Yeah, those are both great questions. I'll take the second one before I forget what I want to say about it. There are some people who think that to have a meaningful life, a life where you've lived well, it should be kind of like a novel. There should be sort of an overall arc. There's a beginning, there's a middle, there's an end, there's a plot development. Towards the end, everything gets resolved well and so on. My personal view is not all lives even now have that kind of structure. But even if some do, that's only one form a meaningful life could take. We may have to learn new ways of living. We may have to learn how to live something more like a serial TV series rather than a novel, or TV series rather than a movie, where things just sort of evolve and change over time. I mean, I'm close enough to retirement. I've begun to think about what I want to do, and I don't know that it will always be philosophy. I've begun to think about other kinds of writing that I might like to try, or maybe get involved in politics behind the scenes. Not as an office seeker. I would never do that. But I think we just have to every now and then sort of reboot ourselves. At least that would be my personal approach. Now, the suicide issue is really interesting. I have a chapter on that. And so far, my book has been reviewed by one philosopher I know of, and he completely mischaracterized the thrust of my argument, took a few remarks from the suicide chapter and presented them as my entire position, which I'm very furious with him about. What I argued is this is, in fact, a serious issue. So what about people who don't want to use life extension? Some of them may worry that by doing so, they're in effect committing suicide. And if they have moral reservations about suicide, if they feel that that's wrong, they may feel that the advent of life extension is putting them in a terrible position. Now that this new technology is here, suddenly they have to make a choice they don't want to make. Suicide, which is immoral, or extended life, which they think is against their interest. Now, what segment of the population, how big would that group of people be? I don't know. One thing I'll say is that even if I, as a philosopher, might disagree with them about the morality of suicide, I have to respect their sincerity and their angst and their moral concern, right? These things are important, even if you disagree with what somebody believes about a thing. So the fact that they feel some distress and moral compunction about this is a thing to be taken very seriously. My personal feeling is that whether suicide is morally right or wrong depends an awful lot on circumstances. I think across the board, blanket answers just don't work. There's no reason to expect every single form of committing suicide is either wrong or right. I mean, the soldier who throws himself on a grenade to save everybody else in his platoon, that's a suicide. I'm not sure it's a wrong one. Or people who are in terrible pain and they want to use euthanasia rather than waiting for the inevitable end. That's a kind of suicide, which my personal view is it's morally permissible. I think the suicides that are morally wrong would be mostly suicides where somebody else is depending on you and you're not really suffering that much from life and you have a moral duty to hang around and finish things, so whoever it is you're helping. But really, when we're talking about lives of 150 years, 200 years, 300 years, it's fairly easy to imagine that not many people would be in that position. Maybe if they just had a kid, they should wait a few decades, but I wouldn't think that it's an immoral species of suicide. But that's just my personal view on it. Yeah. Let me move to the Malthusian threat. I don't know if we'll get to the justice issues tonight, this morning, but I'll try. So Thomas Malthus was an English economist and demographer. And here's a representative quote. His thinking was really very simple. There's no limit on how big a population can get except the food supply. But there is a limit on how big the food supply can get. So eventually we'll have mass starvation. That's the basic idea. So when I talk about a Malthusian threat, I'm simply talking about a population that's grown so large it outstrips the carrying capacity of the environment, either because the environment becomes too polluted and degraded, or because there literally isn't enough fuel or water or food or whatever. This is a very common concern. Here are two scientists who mentioned having run into this concern when they talk to audiences. Richard Miller says, you can't speak in public about longevity research and not run into this concern. Life extension is unethical, some people say, because the world is already overpopulated. Judith Campisi, another well-known scientist, says she gave a lecture and people came up and said, how dare you do this research? Right? And there is some reason to take this quite seriously. So what's the population right now? That should be world, not word. There we go. Well, according to the UN and their demographers, population in 2015 was about 7.3, 7.4 billion. And the projections they run range from high variant projections, fast rate of growth, low variant, and medium variant. So if the rate of increase is sort of in the middle of what they think might happen, the medium variant projections, well, by 2100, we would have 11.2 billion people on the Earth. Now, it's also true fertility rates are falling all over the Earth. In fact, they're almost below replacement level in just about everywhere but sub-Saharan Africa at the moment, and they're falling there as well. Looks like sub-Saharan Africa is probably about a generation behind the rest of the world, but it looks like they too are falling below replacement level. However, life extension could throw a massive monkey wrench into that, and I'll show you why. So when people raise this concern, very often what they'll say is, well, we're going to overpopulate the Earth, so let's not have life extension. Then those in favor of life extension will say, well, you know, we'll find new technologies, we'll feed everybody. Why would you expect people to have that many kids? They've already had their kids and so on. I think this is completely the wrong way to go about it. I think it's silly to try to predict what people are actually going to do under a scenario so distant from the scenario we're in. We really don't know how many people will want to use life extension, how long they'll live, how many kids they'll choose to have, and so on. So rather than guessing, I got together with Mr. Davidpour, the demographer I mentioned, and we came at it from another side. We said, never mind what's going to happen. Let's ask what should happen. What's the target rate of reproduction that we need to hit in order to avoid trouble? So let me walk you through this. So the replacement fertility level for a population with normal life expectancy right now is 2.1 children per woman. That's how demographers talk. It's always per woman because a woman might be with more than one man. The 0.1 is for infant mortality. Well, you might think that if people had life extension and they reproduced at that level, we'd be fine. A new baby for everybody who's dying, but it doesn't work like that. So let's consider a hypothetical population of 1 billion people who all have an extended life. You can scale this up or down according to how widespread you think life extension will be. 11 billion, just multiply it by 10.1. I'll make a few artificial assumptions just to kind of get the machinery going. Let's assume the percentage of women is exactly 50%. We'll leave menopause out. Let's just assume there's no infant mortality just because the calculation is easier. And let's assume that we can specify the average age at which women have children. So here's a scenario. Imagine 1 billion people who live for 150 years on average. I picked that figure because that's pretty close to what scientists think we might get. It's a nice round number. If women had an average of 2 children per woman, some more, some less, and an average age of 25 for the first and 75 for the second, some earlier, some later, and so on, you get a startling result. People are living only a few decades longer, maybe 70 years longer than we do now, having no more children than many couples do now, but the original population of 1 billion people will triple, and it will stay triple forever. We ran the numbers. There's a formula for this in my book, and Mr. Davenport came up with all this stuff. Here's a table. If you look at my book, there's a lot of tables and graphs like this. We plotted it out. This is 1,000 million people, 1 billion people. And notice here, around generation 5, that's after 125 years, the original population triples. And after that, it floats up and down a little bit over time, but it's right around 3 billion from then on. So if life extension became universally used in 2100 and there's 10 billion people, then suddenly the Earth is carrying 30 billion people. Can it do so? I don't know. I don't know what we'll do with hydroponics and other technologies in the future, but I went to see the Mona Lisa in the Louvre a couple of years ago, and you can hardly get near the damn thing now. There's so many people around it. 10 years earlier, I'd seen it, and you could actually get up and look at it and admire it. It's wonderful. All I saw were people taking selfies of themselves. I see pictures of the Great Wall of China now, and it's packed with people. When I saw it in 1993, you could walk around it pretty easily. You have to make reservations to have a vacation in Yosemite now. When I was a kid, we could drive our camper in there and just get a parking spot. So even if you can support that many people, it's going to be difficult in some ways. Let's look at some other numbers. 150-year life expectancy. How about 1.5 children per woman? That's about where the fertility rate is in some places, Italy, Japan. Well, you get a little bit better result. Population increases to 2.65 times its original size, and then it declines indefinitely forever. So if this happens with a population of 10 billion, it goes up to about 26 billion after 125 years, and then slowly drifts back down. But you're still going to have 26, 25, 20 billion, 15 billion for quite a while, and that can be quite a stress. Okay, how about one child? The population doubles, and then it declines rapidly. It's a little easier to work with. So there's really probably no right answer in the sense of something you can prove mathematically as the right level, but I just arbitrarily picked in my book the following figure. I said, if you're going to do this at all, you want to limit it to this. Half a child per woman, that is every other woman has a child. If you do that, the population will increase by 1/3. So that 10 billion would go up to 13.3 billion at year 125. And then it declines indefinitely. So presumably as it declines, you can begin to raise the fertility rate a little bit. They can have 1 3/4 kids and, all that. Now, before I get into what to do about that, let's take a look at the figures for a population with a 1,000-year life expectancy. And I think this, if we get life extension at all, we will get this. Because if you can slow it, you should be able to halt it. I can't think of any reason why you wouldn't. It's just harder, but you'll get there. So what if they have 2 children? You might think this would be catastrophically worse, several times worse. They're living 10 times as, 7 or so times as long. Won't it be many, many times worse? Oddly enough, no. The numbers are really quite surprising. It will increase not to 3 times its original size, but 4 times its original size, even though they're living several times longer. And it stabilizes at 4 times its original size. So how much extra time we get is not really the problem here. The problem kicks in at relatively early stages of life extension. We didn't run numbers for 120 years, but I wouldn't be surprised if they're surprising too. Yeah, so if you had a population of 1,000-year people having half a child per woman at average age of 25, it still increases by only 1/3. But it stays at that level a lot longer. So instead of declining relatively rapidly, as happens at 150-year life expectancy, it declines relatively slowly. For several hundred years, it stays at 1/3 larger and then gradually goes back down. So I argue in my book, and thereby making I'm basically in favor of life extension. I think it should be researched. Not because I think I'm going to get it. I don't think I'm going to live long enough to see it. But I think it's just a good thing. But having said that, this is a massive, massive problem. So the position I took in the book is if you do this, you pretty much have to impose limits on reproduction for those who extend their lives. I call this a policy of forced choice. You have to choose. You choose extended life and accept these limits on your reproduction, and the details of the policy are in the book. Or you can choose a normal life expectancy and just have kids at whatever rate you think is appropriate. But if we don't do that, there will be a Malthusian crisis sooner or later. Yes, sir.
Are you comfortable that a just reproduction limit system can be put in place? Because I don't think the example we have so far in China is too thrilling.
It's not too thrilling. I think what I argue in the book is that China is very different because it's imposed on everybody. There's no choice. And whereas the forced choice that I suggest does give you the option of a normal life expectancy. And if a normal lifespan is enough, which I think most of us believe it is, and some people may choose never to extend their lives, then it's not really asking that much of people to say, look, if you don't like these limits, all you have to do is put up with what the human race has always put up with. Life expectancy is somewhat under 100 years. So I think that's the major difference. It's consensual. It's one of those situations where you accept certain limits on your behavior in order to get something you want that you don't really need. And so I would argue that it's just. But if you feel, I mean, push back if that doesn't sound right to you. It's an interesting question. Yes, sir. I'm sorry, yeah, you.
Well, one thing I don't understand, one thing I don't understand is that if you stop the aging process, isn't that immortality?
Immortality, I think of as impossible and morte. Morte, let's type this out here.
But if you stop the aging process, then you never age.
Yeah.
Don't you live forever?
Well, no, you live until an accident takes you out.
Until the
Yeah. Yeah, till the bus hits you or disease hits you or something. Yeah, or until you just decide to end it yourself. So immortality is impossible, morte, death, impossible to die. And that might be a hellish existence. You know, I don't know. Yes, oh, let me get, sorry, this lady first.
I just wanted to make a comment, and that is, if you gave people the choice to live, you know, use life extension and then impose limits on childbearing, what would keep people from having as many children as they wanted and then starting life extension? That would be a nightmare to try to...
Yeah, the devil's in the details, and I discuss a lot of that in the book. Basically what I say is in those situations, using life extension becomes a lottery. The more kids they've had, the lower the odds they're going to get it. So let's say you've had 5 kids. Okay, go ahead and apply, but understand you don't have a 100% chance of getting life extension. It's now been reduced. And you set it at a level where those who have that many kids, only a few of them get to extend their lives. Those who had 1 kid, more of them get to extend it, and so on. And so everyone would know this, presumably by the time they're in middle school or earlier, and they could make the appropriate choices. But it's a good question. Yes, sir.
The implications of designing your life extension pill so it stops the aging process till at the age of 80 or 100, so the individuals die off like they have for thousands of years at the maximum age of 70 or 100. Problems with that?
In other words, you're thinking of a life extension that would give us no more than 100 years? Well, I don't think there'd be very many problems with it. I mean, I don't know technologically how difficult it would be to sort of calibrate it like that, but I would think maybe the amount of the drug, you know, you give somebody a very small dose, just enough to cut back some of the aging processes, but I can't see any big ethical problems with it. Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting idea. I never thought about that. You might be able to give a sort of low-dose variant for those who want to have kids. Okay, we'll let you go to 105 or something, you know, if there's no great problem in that. Yeah. Oh, I see what you're saying. Again, not a biologist, but I think that's going to be tough, because if aging occurs, it's going to occur throughout the lifespan. So you'd only be youthful during the first part of your life. So if you're living, say, to 120, you know, at age 60, you might look a lot like people do now at 40. It might work out that way. We don't really know how it's going to be, but that's one possible scenario. Unfortunately, I don't know in principle of any way to set it up so you get to be 25 until you're ready to die, and that's it. You know, out you go. It'd be nicer if it could. That would be what they call a rectangular lifespan, where you have the same level of well-being all along till it ends, but it's very hard to achieve. Yes, sir.
One other issue that comes up is retirement age. Are you going to legislate when you can now retire? If you're going to be 50 years old, you can't retire till you're 130 years old.
I think we'd have to go to 401ks, basically. If you can fund it yourself, great. If not, you're going to keep working. Yeah, I mean, I don't see any way to make something like a generous public pension system work under these scenarios. I don't know. Yes, sir.
I'm remembering the quote, but because I'm getting older, I don't remember whose it is. The trick is to die young after a very long time.
Yes. Yeah, I heard that too. I don't know who said it, but it's a great way to put it. Yeah. Yeah. Well, let me just give you real quickly the last issue that I won't be able to give this as much time as I'd like, but the essence of what I have to say is pretty straightforward. Unequal access. All right? Only Jeff Bezos and his friends can have this. Well, that's not a very attractive situation. Or how about anybody who's sort of a middle-class working American can have it, but it's too expensive for anybody below that level to have it? That's a bad situation, too. All right, this is a horrible situation. And many people say we shouldn't fund life extension research. We shouldn't allow this to happen. We should ban it. There's some famous bioethicists who say that, partly because it's unjust. But I think that way of thinking overlooks an important question. There's no doubt this is a morally unattractive situation. The interesting question is, what should you do about it? And there's several questions that get raised. The simplest and first question really is, how do you achieve equality? Well, there's two ways to do it. You can do it by giving something to everybody, or you can do it by denying something to everybody. So there aren't enough hearts available for heart transplants for everyone who needs them. That's an inequality, and it's a regrettable one. You could achieve equality by banning heart transplants. Nobody gets them, all right? That's a more equal situation. And yes, being more equal makes the situation morally better, but more people die makes it morally worse. So what philosophers tend to say is that's the wrong way to achieve equality. They call that leveling down, like equality with a guillotine. And the thought is that the moral value of everyone being treated equally is outweighed by the moral cost of people being needlessly harmed with no corresponding benefit to anybody else. And so there's as much a consensus on this as there is anywhere in philosophy that leveling down is wrong. We ought not to do it. Of course, it doesn't follow that we shouldn't do anything to make life extension available. I think we should. In fact, I think if we can and fail to do so, that might be a reason to inhibit or ban it for a while. So there's a number of questions that come up. For example, what about people who don't want life extension for themselves? Should they be taxed to make this available to everybody else? Something they don't even want for themselves, you know? Or what if you have a group of people who are wealthy and some of them are donating money to make life extension available to the poor and others of them are not? Do you make it available to that group or not? So again, the devil's in the details, and I've got a couple of chapters on this. But my position here is that we have a moral duty of equality, and so if this becomes available as a society, we have a moral duty to make it available to anyone who wants it if they can afford it. How expensive will it be? Here's where I think comparisons with end-of-life care can be a bit misleading. End-of-life care is hideously expensive. You got nurses coming in and out of your room all the time, and expensive equipment, and highly educated doctors coming around. It costs a lot of money. Drugs can be expensive, but consider this. Once they've been developed, the market base is the entire human race. You can distribute those development costs across billions of people. So there's reason to think that with automation and robotics and patents expiring and other things, it may eventually turn out that life extension is as available to everybody as cell phones and calculators are. When I was a kid of 15, I remember one of my friend's father, an engineer, had a calculator. This was about 1973, I don't know. Anyway, it cost him like $300 or $400. And it did very little of what a calculator will do now. And only engineers use them, right? Well, now you can buy one for $5 at CVS. You go anywhere in the third world, you'll see people in dirt poor countries with cell phones. So I think it may turn out that technology eventually becomes something we can make available to everybody, but there'll be a period of time when it can't, and that's going to be a difficult time morally. Any questions on that? Yes, sir. Ma'am, I'm sorry.
How about a lottery?
That's an interesting proposal. I consider that in the book as well. I'm trying to remember what my argument was. I think I ended up concluding that there's two ways you can make it up to the have-nots, as it were, right? One way is a lottery. So let's say 30% of the have-nots, the poor, get life extension, and the other 70% don't. The other way you could make it up to the poor, so to speak, is to simply give them a cash subsidy that doesn't buy life extension, it buys a lot of other things. And I argued in the book that would be a better way to do it, only because it treats them all equally. None of them get it, but they all get something, and they all get the same amount. So I argued for that solution. But again, this is one of those devil in the detail questions that I think has to be addressed. Yes, sir.
Do you have a book table here for sale?
No, I don't. I have nothing. It's on Amazon. Happy if you bought it.
Could you
Yeah.
show the
Oh, the cover? Yeah. Let me go back up here. Hang on here. Yeah, it's MIT Press, MIT Press priced it very nicely. They priced it at $40. which is really pretty affordable as books go, and it's a hardback. So you get a nice, well-bound hardback for $40 with a pretty cover, and there it is again, and thank you very much.